My formal qualifications are a degree in science and law and a PhD in law. My qualifications to speak for the river are more from an invitation and being part of a group, of a team who has worked to look at the range of different interacting values of the system and how legal systems, the non-Indigenous legal system, can be combined with the existing law, the first law, to provide a future for the river. And I'd also like to acknowledge Anne's work on the legal work that we've been doing, but also where's Donna? And Donna Bagnall has been doing excellent work, contributing to all of the work we're doing, looking at how different legal systems can coexist and can work together for the future of this globally unique Mardoowarra. So Anne's spoken to us about the first laws, the laws of the Wallangori, the law of the river, which tells us the story of how the river is a snake the rainbow serpent, which needs to be treated as a whole from the beginning to the end. And also the importance not only of what we take from the river, but the obligations to that river. And also talks to us about the Wunan law, a system of regional governance. These are the first laws. On top of that, there are also non-Indigenous laws which work as threats to the river. Some of the threats include the proposed amendments to the EPBC Act, the white paper on northern development talks about how there's the intention to make the EPBC Act more efficient for investment. So we can think about the threats that come with that. At the same time, there's the Aboriginal Heritage Bill, the WA Aboriginal Heritage Bill, which, if it goes ahead in its current form, will mean that delisting of Aboriginal heritage sites could occur without any consultation with Indigenous people. Go ahead. And at the same time, there's the Water Resources Bill, which is on the table, as well as changes to pastoral management. And to add to that, one of the key issues that's already been talked about is native title. So we are not saying we need to get rid of native title. What we are saying is the essence of native title has been lost. The recognition of the connection to land, the recognition of the First People's rights and obligations to that land has been lost in the way in which subsequent laws have come in to change the essence of native title, to make it so it's an oppressive system which has lost its original meaning, which has lost the recognition that there were existing laws, that there are existing living laws of the land and of the river, and instead creating all these barriers for traditional custodians to recognise what is theirs, and at the same time creating this sense that what is recognised by both first laws and non-Indigenous laws, creating that sense that that has not the meaning which was granted, which was recognised in the initial start of talking about native title. Moratorium on the threats that Vic and Anne have spoken about, a moratorium against activities which would be destructive and potentially create irreversible effects to this complete living system. However, we recognise the political nature of creating a moratorium in the Mardoowarra. We've seen it in Victoria. The political will for doing the same thing in WA might create a significant challenge, and therefore we look at another immediate strategy and therefore look at perhaps a judicial strategy such as an injunction. And an injunction based on the legitimate expectation that comes from the precautionary principles of ecological sustainable development, but also drawing on principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, where what I should start by explaining is there's also a very complicated property system across the Mardoowarra. You've got a range of different native title claims, as well as some native title which has been recognised. At the same time, you've got state heritage listing, national heritage listing, and yet mining tenements have been granted on top of that. So what the injunction would be calling for is to restricting activities which would have an irreversible effect based on the legitimate expectation that the precautionary principle, that ecological sustainable development, and that the free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous people would be taken into account. And in terms of a longer term strategy, we're talking about, and we're asking the Tribunal panel to support us in talking about a treaty for the Mardoowarra. The reason why we're talking about a treaty and not legislation is because a treaty changes the dialogue. It is about Mardoowarra nations coming together as sovereign people to agree on what the future of the river should be. And yet that future is based on existing law. The existing law we've already been talking about, the law of the river, the Walangari law, the law of the river, the principles which recognise that the river should be an integrated whole, that recognise that we all have a role in that river, that invite Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to participate in ensuring the continuation of that river, as well as a governance system. And that is the Wunan governance system. So it would bring together within a treaty framework which recognises the sovereignty of traditional owners and would bring together existing law within a treaty framework.
Excellent suggestion about a treaty. Can you tell us, I understand that you've been looking at the interesting developments in New Zealand around the Whanganui River and the Mardoowarra Forest. Can you tell us a little bit, particularly for the folks here who might not be familiar, what is unique about what's going on in New Zealand, the fact that many earth lawyers are fascinated by it and excited by it? Can you tell us a bit about that?
So with the Whanganui River, very similar, but recognising the river itself as being a legal person. And we're drawing on some of what is included in the Whanganui Agreement, and one of the principles that's included within there is the integrity of the whole of the river. And we're drawing on a similar thing, but drawing on the ancient songline as well, which recognises the integrity of the whole of the river. The reason why we are suggesting a slightly different framework to that in New Zealand is because New Zealand has its Waitangi. So instead of going through the framework of the treaty which is existing in New Zealand, we're coming in talking about treaty over the river in absence of a treaty with the Australian government and Indigenous people.
No, it's quite an ingenious suggestion. I'm very excited by it. So can I just ask, where are you guys up to in actually drawing that up? Have you started looking at what the structure would be, or is that something you want to call on the earth lawyers in the audience to come and play?
So we have been, and we'll speak a little bit more, but as I was saying earlier, it's based on the songline. Even though there's a range of different language groups around the river, they have the same existing songline and based on the governance structures of the Wunan. But I defer to Anne.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. What is happening, as I said, this is all about process, and it's in a circular storytelling way, so we don't control the past, the present or the future, but we act in this moment in time. So on the 3rd and 4th of November, all of the tribes that stood for the National Heritage Listing will be meeting in Fitzroy Crossing. And so I have prepared a Mardoowarra declaration, and from that, that is the start of the conversation of how we combined all of the river nations together to work towards the long-term process of a treaty. So this, as I said, in terms of the Freerian concept, we want to move from anti-dialogic action to dialogic action. And part of that healing mechanism is to once again have all the tribes stand together, all of the nations, in this transboundary process, nation to nation, and validate that we do not have the right to allow our river, our sacred river, to be destroyed. And that we, as the guardians and the custodians of that river, must stand recognising Wurundjeri law. And as Michelle said, all of us hold that one songline. So the dialogue is starting. We now need to transfer that into action, short-term goals, but a long-term vision of reality.
The world leading, it's going to lead Australia into a very different legal future, and I'm very excited to hear further down the track how others engaged with this tribunal, engaged with AILA and other spaces can be of support. I think it's awesome. I just wanted to see if the panel had any other questions at the moment. Gil?
A comment and a question from Michelle. I just wanted to say how interested I was in what you were saying, and particularly about the combining of laws. I think you've probably established a new paradigm for the tired old law school course in conflict of laws. Just to make it clear, and perhaps to settle some issues or doubts in the minds of some people, do you accept that the positive law of the state is useful or beneficial for the rights of nature? Or is it, in a sense, because you see it necessary to work within the framework of positive law of the state?
I think it's in there, but recognising that law is part of that political system, and that there is the need to use the existing tools, but at the same time recognising the limitations of those tools, but also creating awareness of existing law at the same time, and starting to think about what are the ways in which the two systems can work together. In some ways, I see it as the issue, like having dual citizenship. You're not less a citizen of one country because you have a passport from another country, just as you're no less your father's daughter because you're also your mother's daughter. So looking for ways in which we can envisage a paradigm which does bring in a range of different strategies and the collective wisdom that Anne talks about.
I just want to let you know that, thank you. Some more questions.
This is probably more a comment, this is a comment and not a question. It might be useful to look at the UN International Treaty Study that the chair of that study, Miguel Martinez, prepared, spent a number of years working on, but that's accessible through the UN document system. And the work also of Isabel Schultz-Tenkhoff, who worked with Miguel on the treaty study, and some of the concerns that were raised as a result of that study, and which Tenkhoff refers to as the domestic paradigm, which deals with, is a critique of the issues, and has already worked through some of the concerns that I have about, you know, the meeting of, as Gil mentioned, the laws of the state, the positivist system, and also the sovereign laws of First Nations. So you might find that a useful resource.
Are there other questions? Yes, Brendan, or comments?
Yeah, I think just a comment as well. So, you know, in terms of progressing drafting, not so much the treaty, but the kind of maybe regulations that might flow from the treaty for managing, for collectively managing the whole living river system. I think there are some really useful ethical and legal principles that can be drawn upon to deal with that issue that was raised, that, you know, the onus of proof always seems to fall on the river protector to somehow prove that the development is not going to cause harm. So, you know, this is an opportunity to reverse the burden of proof. And, you know, the Earth Charter, which has been endorsed by UNESCO and the IUCN, it's actually been endorsed by the Australian Senate. This is a little known fact. It has a principle 6A which reads, place the burden of proof on those who argue that a proposed activity will not cause significant harm and make the responsible parties liable for environmental harm. So if that was our guiding principle when it came to this kind of major industrial scale developments in a system like that, the whole environmental impact process, etc., would be quite different. And the other principle worth noting is the Principle 3 in the Principles for Promoting the Environmental Rule of Law, in dubio pro natura. In cases of doubt, matters should be resolved in a way most likely to favour the protection and conservation of the environment.
Very good. Just wanted to check in, yep, with Benna. We've got 5 or 6 minutes and then we'll be closing, and we'll turn to Gordon for some closing remarks, and if Anne had wanted to say anything else, but we'll just have just 1 or 2 more questions from us.
Yes, native title was mentioned a couple of times, and knowing the quagmire of complexity and distraction and difficulty that that jurisdiction presents, it's often very difficult for people who don't have contact with it to understand how disenfranchising it has become. And looking at the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, Article 32 talks to Indigenous peoples having the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands or territories and other resources, as well as all of the other kind of cultural and autonomy rights embedded in that declaration. And I just wondered if you might elaborate a little bit on the right to negotiate aspects of the Native Title Act and how they're very far from providing equality or access to justice.
So in terms of that, I'll just refer back to the findings of the CERD, which found that, which is the UN Committee on the Elimination on Racial Discrimination, which found that it was against the Convention to only grant a right to negotiate and not the right to say no within the amendments to the Native Title Act, which came in 1998.
Yeah.
No, just to add the point that 2017 is the decade since the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was signed and agreed to. And I think it's quite timely that one of the challenges for sovereign people in this country is that that has never been domesticated in Australian law. So if we're on a journey of setting legal precedents, this could be such a case.
Well, just a quick comment in response to that. It's a declaration, and so it's in terms of it becoming domesticated as part of domestic Australian law. The whole ratification process is dependent upon the declaration becoming a convention, which is in somewhat a stalemate scenario in the whole UN mechanisms currently. So I just make that comment.
And I would respond with to thank you for your comments you made yesterday about how UNDRIP's going towards being recognised as customary law and customary international law, and therefore the obligation of Australia to not act against customary international law.
Yeah.
But I take your point, thank you.